Sleepy Hollow had always been a town wrapped in mystery, its very name conjuring images of eerie nights and strange happenings. The arrival of Ichabod Crane only served to deepen the shadows that seemed to hang over the place like a thick fog. Tall and lanky, with a pale complexion and a nervous disposition, Crane's appearance alone was enough to unsettle those who laid eyes on him. But what truly set the townspeople on edge was his odd behavior, his tales of terror, and his unsettling fascination with the darker aspects of life. From the moment he set foot in Sleepy Hollow, Ichabod Crane was determined to make an impression. He arrived in the small, isolated village as the new schoolmaster. His arrival met with equal parts curiosity and apprehension. With his gaunt frame, sharp features, and almost comically large feet, Crane looked more like a scarecrow brought to life than a man. His appearance was unusual enough, but it was his strange behavior that soon began to draw the attention of the villagers. Crane took to his duties with a dedication that bordered on obsession. He was strict with the children, his lessons often veering into dark topics that made even the most resilient students squirm. He filled their heads with stories of ghosts and spirits, warning them of the dangers that lurked in the shadows. But there was one tale he returned to again and again, the legend of the Headless Horseman. According to Crane, the horseman was the ghost of a Hessian soldier who had lost his head to a cannonball during some nameless battle of the American Revolution. Now, the spirit was doomed to ride through the night, searching for his lost head. Crane described the phantom in vivid detail, relishing the fear it inspired in his listeners. He claimed to have seen the horseman himself, galloping through the woods, headless and terrifying. The townsfolk, superstitious as they were, listened to Crane's stories with rapt attention. They began to see shadows where there were none, to hear hoofbeats in the wind, and to shiver at the thought of the horseman's approach. Crane's tales took on a life of their own, spreading through the town like wildfire. Soon, everyone in Sleepy Hollow was talking about the Headless Horseman. But while the villagers trembled in fear of the ghostly rider, Ichabod Crane reveled in their terror. He knew the power of a good story, the way it could grip the imagination and warp reality. The more he spoke of the horseman, the more people believed him. And the more they believed him, the less they noticed the truth. For Ichabod Crane had not come to Sleepy Hollow to teach. He had come to hunt. Crane's fascination with the macabre had begun long before his arrival in Sleepy Hollow. As a child, he had been drawn to stories of death and decay, to the gruesome tales whispered by the elders in his hometown. But what began as a morbid curiosity soon grew into something far darker. By the time he reached adulthood, Crane had become obsessed with the idea of murder. The power it offered, the control it gave him over life and death, was intoxicating. But Crane was no fool. He knew he could never reveal his true nature. He needed a way to hide his impulses, to mask his deeds beneath a veil of fear and superstition. The Headless Horseman was the perfect cover. When Crane first arrived in Sleepy Hollow, he carefully cultivated an image of himself as a timid, bookish man, easily frightened and wholly harmless. He played the part of the coward to perfection, flinching at every shadow and shying away from the mere mention of violence. But beneath the facade, his mind was always at work, calculating and scheming. The first time Crane killed, it was almost too easy. He chose a drifter, a man no one in the village would miss. Under the cover of night, Crane followed him into the woods, his heart pounding with a mixture of fear and exhilaration. When the man stopped to rest by a fallen log, Crane struck. A quick, efficient slash with a knife was all it took. The man's eyes widened in shock, his hands clutching at the wound as blood spilled out onto the forest floor. Crane watched him die, fascinated by the way life flickered out like a candle in the wind. It was only after the man was dead that Crane realized the full extent of his genius. He had removed the man's head, just as he had described in his tales of the Headless Horseman. The connection between the murder and the legend was unmistakable. And so, when the body was discovered the next day, the villagers were quick to blame the ghostly rider. Crane, feigning terror, confirmed their suspicions with his usual theatrics, describing the horseman in such detail that no one questioned the story. The ruse worked better than Crane could have imagined. The townsfolk were so blinded by their fear of the horseman that they never once considered the possibility of a human killer. Crane was free to continue his spree, each new murder fueling the legend he had so carefully crafted. In the months that followed, several more victims fell to Crane's blade. Each time, he took great care to stage the bodies in a way that reinforced the story of the Headless Horseman. Heads were removed, bodies were left in the woods or near the old churchyard, and Crane himself would often discover the remains, his performance always one of genuine horror. But Crane's success came at a cost. With each kill, the legend of the Headless Horseman grew, and so too did the fear in the hearts of the villagers. They began to shun the woods at night, to lock their doors and windows, and to avoid the places where the horseman was said to ride. Sleepy Hollow, once a quiet and peaceful village, became a place of suspicion and dread. The only person who seemed unaffected by the growing terror was Katrina Van Tassel, the beautiful daughter of the town's wealthiest landowner. Katrina was the object of every man's desire, and Ichabod Crane was no exception. But unlike the other suitors, Crane had no interest in winning her heart through charm or kindness. He saw Katrina as another conquest, a prize to be claimed. Katrina, however, was not easily swayed. She saw through Crane's timid facade, sensing the darkness that lurked beneath his surface. She found him repulsive, and her dismissive attitude only fueled Crane's obsession. He became fixated on the idea of possessing her, his thoughts growing darker with each passing day. But Crane was patient. He knew that his time would come. And when it did, he would ensure that Katrina Van Tassel was his, one way or another. The opportunity presented itself on a cold, moonless night in late October. The village was in the grip of an early frost, and the air was thick with the scent of burning wood. The Van Tassels were hosting a grand feast at their estate, a gathering of all the prominent families in the area. It was a night of revelry, of food and drink and merriment, but there was an undercurrent of fear that no amount of laughter could dispel. Crane arrived at the party in his usual fashion, slinking in the shadows, his eyes scanning the crowd for Katrina. She was easy to find, her golden hair catching the light of the candles as she danced with another man, a burly, boisterous fellow named Brom Bones. Brom was everything Crane was not, strong, confident, and adored by the townsfolk. He was also the only man who had ever openly questioned Crane's tales of the Headless Horseman, mocking him for his fear and suggesting that the ghostly rider was nothing more than a figment of Crane's imagination. Crane hated Brom with a burning intensity, and he had often fantasized about silencing him for good. But he knew that Brom was a popular figure in the village, and his disappearance would raise too many questions. No, Brom had to be dealt with in a different way. As the night wore on, the party spilled out into the gardens, where the guests continued their celebrations beneath the stars. It was here that Crane saw his chance. Katrina had wandered away from the crowd, seeking a moment of solitude by the edge of the woods. Crane followed her, moving silently through the shadows until he was standing just a few feet behind her. "Katrina," he whispered, his voice low and insidious. She turned, startled by his sudden appearance. "Ichabod? What are you doing out here?" "I wanted to speak with you," Crane said, stepping closer. "To warn you." "Warn me?" Katrina's eyes narrowed in suspicion. "About what?" Crane's face twisted into a mask of false concern. "The Headless Horseman. He rides tonight, Katrina. I've seen him. He's coming for us all." Katrina shook her head, unimpressed by Crane's theatrics. "You're a fool, Ichabod. I don't believe in your stories, and neither should you." Crane's expression darkened. "You should believe, Katrina. You should believe, or you'll end up like the others." She took a step back, sensing the change in his tone. "What are you talking about?" Crane's eyes gleamed with a mad light. "The horseman doesn't just take anyone, you know. He chooses his victims. Those who deserve it. Those who stand in his way." Katrina's heart began to race as she realized the danger she was in. "You're not talking about the horseman," she whispered. "You're talking about yourself." Crane smiled, a cold, cruel smile. "You're smarter than I gave you credit for, Katrina. But it's too late now. No one will hear you scream out here. No one will know what really happened. He reached for her, his long fingers curling around her wrist like a vice. But Katrina was not as helpless as he believed. With a sudden burst of strength, she wrenched her arm free and ran back toward the house, her heart pounding in her chest. Crane watched her go, a twisted grin spreading across his face. Let her run. Let her tell the others. It would only make his final act all the more satisfying. By the time Katrina reached the safety of the house, she was breathless and trembling. She burst into the main hall, her eyes wild with fear. "Brom," she cried, searching the crowd for her suitor. "Brom, where are you?" Brom Bones, who had been engaged in a drinking contest with several of the other men, looked up at the sound of her voice. He frowned as he saw the panic on her face and quickly made his way over to her. "Katrina? What's wrong?" "It's Ichabod," she gasped, clutching at Brom's arm. "He's mad. He's the one behind all the killings. He just tried to—" She broke off, unable to finish the sentence. Brom's face hardened, and he looked around the room, searching for any sign of the schoolmaster. "Where is he?" "I don't know," Katrina said, her voice trembling. "He was outside, but he might have followed me back." Brom didn't wait for more information. He turned and shouted for the other men to follow him, then led the charge out into the gardens, his jaw set with determination. Katrina stayed behind, her heart still racing as she watched them go. The men spread out through the gardens, searching every shadow, every tree, but there was no sign of Ichabod Crane. It was as if he had vanished into thin air. But Brom wasn't ready to give up. He knew the woods well, and he had a feeling that Crane wouldn't have gone far. "Stay close," Brom warned the others as they moved deeper into the forest. "He's a coward, but he's dangerous. We need to find him before he finds anyone else." They moved carefully, weapons at the ready, their eyes scanning the darkness for any sign of movement. The woods were eerily quiet, the only sound the crunch of leaves beneath their boots. Brom's heart pounded in his chest as he thought of Katrina, her terror-stricken face flashing before his eyes. He couldn't let Crane get away with this. He had to end it, once and for all. Suddenly, a rustling sound came from behind them, and the men spun around, their weapons raised. But it was only a deer, darting away through the trees. Brom cursed under his breath, his nerves on edge. But then, in the distance, they heard something else. The faint sound of a horse's hooves, growing louder with each passing moment. Brom's blood ran cold as he realized what it was. The headless horseman. The men exchanged uneasy glances, their resolve wavering. They had all heard the stories, and now, in the dead of night, those stories seemed all too real. Brom knew he had to act quickly before fear overtook them all. "Stand your ground," he shouted, trying to rally the men. "It's just Crane, trying to scare us. Don't let him." But as the sound of hooves grew nearer, the men began to back away, their courage faltering. Brom was about to shout another command when a figure appeared in the darkness, riding toward them with terrifying speed. It was the headless horseman, just as Crane had described. The rider's decapitated body swayed in the saddle, the stump of its neck spewing forth a thick, black mist. The horse's eyes glowed with an unnatural fire, its hooves striking the ground with thunderous force. The men broke ranks, fleeing in terror as the horseman charged toward them. Brom stood his ground, his jaw clenched in determination. He knew it was Crane, dressed in some elaborate costume, trying to scare them off. But even as he raised his weapon to defend himself, doubt gnawed at the edges of his mind. What if Crane had been telling the truth all along? Before Brom could react, the horseman was upon him. A flash of steel caught the moonlight, and Brom felt a sharp pain in his side. He gasped, stumbling back as the horseman rode past, his sword dripping with blood. Brom fell to the ground, clutching at his wound, as the horseman disappeared into the night. He could hear the panicked shouts of the other men as they scattered, leaving him alone in the darkness. He tried to call out for help, but his voice was weak, his strength fading fast. All he could think of was Katrina, of how he had failed to protect her. And then, as the darkness closed in around him, Brom Bones knew no more. By the time the sun rose over Sleepy Hollow, the village was in an uproar. The story of what had happened in the woods spread like wildfire, growing more exaggerated with each telling. Brom Bones was found barely clinging to life, his wound grievous but not fatal. He was delirious, muttering about the headless horseman and how he had been attacked by the ghostly rider. But Ichabod Crane was nowhere to be found. Some said he had fled in fear, others that he had been taken by the horseman himself. The truth was never known, for Crane's body was never recovered, and the schoolmaster was never seen again. The legend of the Headless Horseman lived on, growing stronger with each passing year. The people of Sleepy Hollow spoke of it in hushed tones, warning their children to stay away from the woods at night. But there were those who wondered if the horseman was not the real villain of the tale. For there were whispers, passed down through generations, of a man who had come to Sleepy Hollow with dark intentions, a man who had hidden his true nature behind a mask of fear and superstition. And so, the story of Ichabod Crane became part of the legend, a cautionary tale about the dangers of trusting appearances and the darkness that can lurk in even the most unassuming hearts. For in the end, it was not the Headless Horseman who haunted the people of Sleepy Hollow, but the memory of a man who had turned their fears against them, leaving them to wonder if the real monster had ever truly been defeated.